The snow had already started when I heard the lock click. Not the front door. The back gate. The one leading into the yard I'd maintained for 31 years. The gate my late wife used to walk through every evening after her shift at St. Michael's Hospital, her scrubs still smelling like antiseptic, her hands cold from the November air. I'd built that gate myself. Cedar. Took me a whole weekend. My daughter had changed the lock. I stood there in my driveway, my key in my hand, my truck running behind me with the heat on, and I looked at that gate and I thought, this is it. This is what it's come to. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to where this really started, because that part matters more than most people realize. I spent 34 years with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. Started as a field technician up near Sault Ste. Marie, working on forestry surveys, sleeping in trailers that leaked, eating sandwiches that froze solid by noon. Worked my way up slowly, the way you do when you actually care about the work more than the title. By the time I took early retirement at 62, I was managing a regional team out of Thunder Bay. I wasn't a rich man, but I was a careful one. My wife and I had paid off the house in Sudbury in full by 2009. We had a small TFSA, a decent RRSP, and a self-directed investment account I'd been quietly adding to since the early 90s. Nothing spectacular, just patience. My wife passed in the winter of 2021. Ovarian cancer. 11 months from diagnosis to the end. I won't describe those 11 months in detail because I don't have the words for it, and I don't think I ever will. What I'll say is this. After she was gone, the house felt like it was made of a different material than it used to be. Same walls, same floors, same kitchen, where she used to leave her coffee cup half full on the counter. But heavier somehow, like the air itself had thickened. My daughter and her husband had been living in Calgary. She'd moved there for him. He was in oil and gas, one of those project management roles that sounds important until you realize the whole industry runs on borrowed time and borrowed money. They'd been renting, had a child, my grandson, who had just turned 4. After my wife died, my daughter called me every Sunday. We talked. She cried. I mostly listened. Then in the spring of 2022, she called and said things weren't going well out west. Her husband had lost his contract. The rental market in Calgary was brutal. Could they come stay with me for a bit, just until they got back on their feet? 6 months, maybe 8. I said yes. Of course I said yes. She's my daughter. She's all I had left. They arrived in May with a moving truck, 3 cats, and more kitchen appliances than I had counter space for, my son-in-law. I'll call him by what he was to me, and which was my daughter's husband. Shook my hand at the door and said, "We really appreciate this, sir. We won't be in your way." He seemed like he meant it at the time. The first few weeks were fine. My grandson was good company, actually. He had my wife's eyes. This boy. The same shade of gray-green that would shift depending on the light. We'd sit on the back step in the evenings and watch the bats come out, and he'd ask me questions I didn't always know how to answer. Why do bats sleep upside down? Do trees feel cold? I liked those evenings. By August, things had shifted in ways I couldn't quite name at first. My daughter had taken over the kitchen in the way that felt less like making herself at home and more like claiming territory. Not because she was cooking. She wasn't, really. It was more that my things kept disappearing. My cast iron pan that I'd had since I was 28 went into a cabinet I couldn't reach. My coffee grinder got replaced with one of those pod machines. Small things, I told myself. Adaptations. You live with people, you adjust. Her husband had found some kind of remote consulting work, though he was vague about what exactly it involved. He was on calls a lot. He'd taken over the spare room I'd used as a home office, where I kept my files, my old field notebooks, my wife's sewing box that I'd never moved because I wasn't ready to. One morning, I went in to look for something, and my desk had been replaced with his setup, 2 monitors, a headset, a whiteboard on the wall. I asked my daughter when that had happened. She said she'd mentioned it. She hadn't. I let it go. I should have let nothing go, but I'm 66 years old, and I grew up in a family where you picked your battles carefully, and I told myself this wasn't the battle worth picking. By October, the word facility came up for the first time. We were sitting at dinner. My daughter had made something from a meal kit, the kind that comes in a cardboard box and takes 40 minutes, even when the instructions say 20. My grandson had already gone to bed. Her husband was talking about a trip they wanted to take in the spring, something about renting a cottage on Vancouver Island. I asked how that fit into the budget given everything, and he set down his fork in that particular way. That means someone is about to reframe a conversation. We've actually been thinking, he said, about the long term, about how you're doing, about what makes sense. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at her plate. There's a really well-regarded place, he said, just outside of Barrie. It's not a nursing home. It's more like an independent living community. They have a golf simulator, if you can believe it. He said that last part like it was a selling point. Like I was the kind of man who would be comforted by the existence of a golf simulator. I'm 66, I said. Dad, my daughter said, not meeting my eyes. We're just thinking ahead. I managed field crews in -30 weather for a decade, I said. I'm fine. The conversation moved on, but I sat with that word facility. The way you sit with a bruise, pressing on it to see how deep it goes. Winter came. The house felt crowded in a way that had nothing to do with the number of people in it. My grandson and I still had our evenings on the back step, though it was too cold by December, so we'd moved to the sunroom. I'd shown him how to identify Orion and Cassiopeia. He called Orion the shoulder man. In January, I noticed something off with my investment account. I'd been checking it the first of every month, the habit of a careful man. I logged in on a Tuesday morning, and the balance was lower than it should have been. Not dramatically, not alarmingly, just a gap I couldn't account for. I thought I'd made an error, maybe confused myself with a withdrawal I'd forgotten. I printed the statement, sat with it for 2 days. There was a transfer I hadn't made. $4,000 moved to an account number I didn't recognize. I'm going to be very careful here about what I say next because I want to be accurate. I didn't panic. I didn't accuse anyone. I made an appointment with my bank TD, the branch on Elm Street I'd been using since 1998, and I sat down with an advisor named, I believe, Kwame, who was patient and thorough and treated me like I had a full set of working faculties, which I appreciate more than people know. The transfer had been authorized. That's what he told me. Authorized from the account, using credentials that were correct. The only people who had ever been in my home office, the one her husband now used, were family. I went home and I said nothing. I'm not sure why. Some combination of disbelief and the kind of paralysis that comes when the worst-case version of a thought starts to feel plausible. I went upstairs, made tea, and sat at my bedroom window watching the neighbor's dog dig at something in the snow. By March, there had been 2 more transfers, smaller ones, 900, 1100. I had been quietly documenting everything, printing statements, keeping them in an envelope inside my winter coat, which I knew they would never touch. I'd also started leaving a small recorder, the kind I used to use for field notes, a Sony ICD that runs on 2AS, in the room where I kept my important papers. I won't describe everything I heard on those recordings. Some of it I'm still not ready to say out loud. What I will say is that the conversation I heard one Thursday evening in late March removed any remaining doubt I might have been holding on to. My daughter and her husband were talking about a power of attorney, about how, once it was in place, managing the estate, they used that word, estate, like I was already gone, would be straightforward. They talked about the house, about what it would fetch on the current Sudbury market, which had been decent. They talked about the timeline, 6 weeks, her husband said. My daughter said nothing for a moment. And then she said, okay. That okay is what I keep coming back to, not his plan. Men like him have always existed, and I was not naive enough to be surprised by him. It was her silence before that okay. The length of it, the way I could almost feel her making a decision I would never fully understand. I went to bed that night and did not sleep. The next morning, I made one phone call. I want to explain why I called who I called, because it will seem odd if I don't give you the context. When I worked for the ministry, there was a period, maybe a decade, give or take, when I worked closely with a team that included a woman named Adele Szymanski. Adele was a lawyer, specifically an estates and property lawyer, who had done some consulting work for the ministry on land trust questions up near Temagami. We'd worked together on 3 separate files over the years. She'd become, over that time, a friend. She sent me a card when my wife died. I sent her one when her husband did a year later. I called Adele. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I knew. I read her the account numbers. I told her about the recordings. There was a pause on her end, not a long one. And she said, "Stay where you are. Don't move anything. Don't say anything to them." "Can you get me those recordings?" I said I could. She said, "Good. And listen to me. You need to call your bank today and ask them to freeze any transactions above $500, pending secondary authorization. Tell them you have reason to believe someone has unauthorized access to your credentials. They will do this. This is a real thing they can do." I called TD from my truck, parked in the Canadian Tire parking lot on the Salle, so there was no chance of being heard. The branch manager I spoke to, once I explained the situation and mentioned that I had documentation, was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "I'm going to escalate this internally as well, if that's all right with you. We take this type of thing very seriously." She used the phrase elder financial abuse. It was the first time I'd heard someone else say it out loud about my own life. I sat in that parking lot for a while after the call. It was April by then, one of those fall spring days we get in northern Ontario, where it looks warm, but it's still only 6 degrees, and the ground is soft in patches and frozen in others. A man walked past with a retriever on a leash, and the retriever stopped and looked at me through the passenger window for a moment with those deep retriever eyes. I remember thinking that was the most understood I'd felt in months. I drove home, cooked dinner, said nothing. What happened in the weeks that followed was not dramatic in the way I think people expect when they hear a story like this. It wasn't a single confrontation, a door slamming, a shouted revelation. It was quieter and more methodical than that, which I think was actually worse for them. Adele moved quickly. She had a colleague in Sudbury, a litigator named, I'll just say he was experienced, I won't use his name, who filed a civil claim based on the documentation I had. The recordings, the bank statements, the account numbers. The transfers totaled just over $19,000 by the time everything was tallied. The unauthorized power of attorney that had apparently been drafted, I didn't know this until Adele told me, was found to be fraudulent because my signature had been forged on a document I had never signed. In Canada, a fraudulent POA attempt carries serious consequences. My daughter's husband knew this. He simply hadn't expected to be caught. The morning the legal documents arrived at the house, served by a process server while I was conveniently at the grocery store, I am told by my neighbor Gerda, who watches everything from her front window with the dedication of a retired customs officer, that my daughter stood on the porch for a long time, just holding the envelope. I came home an hour later. She was waiting in the kitchen. She looked at me like she was trying to find something in my face. Maybe she was looking for an opening. Maybe she was looking for the version of me who would apologize for defending myself. I put my groceries down on the counter. She said, "Dad, I need you to understand," I said. "I understand everything I need to." She started to cry. Her husband came in from the spare room, my office, and started talking quickly about misunderstandings, about intentions, about how they'd been under so much pressure and had just needed a bridge, a short-term thing. They'd always intended to pay it back. I held up my hand. I've spent 34 years in government work. I have sat across the table from logging companies with million-dollar interests and lawyers whose billable hours exceeded my annual salary. I know exactly what it looks like when someone is performing remorse as a negotiating tactic. "You'll need to make arrangements," I said. "I'll give you 3 weeks." They were gone in 11 days. I won't tell you I was at peace. I won't pretend that the exit of my daughter and my grandson from my house felt like victory, because that would be a lie and the story is not a lie. I sat in the kitchen the evening after they left, and I ate a bowl of soup by myself. and the house was very quiet, and I thought about my wife, the way you do, the way grief doubles back on you when you're not prepared for it. She would have known what to do with all of this. She always had a clarity about family that I struggled to match. She saw people for what they were, without needing the evidence first. I thought about my grandson. That was the hardest part. He's 5 now. He didn't choose any of this, and children almost never do. I've sent him a birthday card and a book about constellations. Whether he received them, I don't know yet. The Sybil matter was settled out of court. The full amount recovered. My daughter's husband avoided criminal charges by a narrower margin than he knows. Adele told me he was spoken to very clearly about what a second error in judgment would cost him. I believe she used language that left no ambiguity. My investment account is back where it should be. The back gate has a new lock. I put it in myself, same cedar post, different hardware. It was a cold day when I did it, early November, and my hands ached a bit with the screwdriver, but I got it done. The mortgage on this house has been paid since 2009. The deed is in my name alone. I've updated my will and my estate documents with Adele's office, and there is nothing in them that can be misread or misrepresented. I have a durable power of attorney assigned to a person I trust completely, someone I worked with for 20 years who has nothing to gain and no reason to act against my interests. I still check my accounts on the 1st of every month. Old habits. Some evenings, when the light goes a certain way in the late afternoon, I go out to the back step, and I sit for a while. I think about the shoulder man and his stars. I think about cedar and cold air, and the sound a gate makes when it closes right. I don't hate my daughter. I've thought about this a lot, and I want to be honest about it. What I feel is something more complicated than hate, something I don't have a clean word for. Grief, maybe. Not for what happened. For what was there before it, and what isn't anymore. But I'm still here. My house is still my house, and some mornings, when the light comes through the kitchen window, the way it did when my wife used to leave her coffee half-finished on the counter, I stand there and I just breathe, and that feels like enough. For now, that's enough. People ask me sometimes, not often, but sometimes, whether I regret letting them move in at all. Whether I would do it differently if I could go back to that May morning when the moving truck pulled into my driveway and my daughter hugged me on the front step. I've sat with that question long enough now to give an honest answer. No, I wouldn't change it. Not because what happened was fine, it wasn't. Not because the betrayal didn't cost me something permanent. It did. But because what I learned about myself through all of it is worth more than the comfort of never having been tested. And I think that's true for most people, even when it doesn't feel that way at the time. Here's what I've come to understand. Slowly and not without some difficulty, the way people treat you is almost always a reflection of what they believe you will allow. My daughter's husband saw a grieving older man living alone in a paid-off house and made a calculation. That calculation told him I was manageable, that I could be quietly moved aside, that a man who had spent his career in government offices and field surveys up north wouldn't know how to fight back, or wouldn't have the will to. He was wrong on both counts, but what I had to ask myself, what I think is worth asking, is why he felt safe making that calculation at all. And the honest answer is that for too long I let things slide. The coffee grinder. The home office. The small erosions that I told myself weren't worth the confrontation. Every time I let something go, I was teaching him something about what I would tolerate. Patience has its place. But there is a version of patience that is actually just avoidance, and I had been practicing that version without realizing it. What stopped the whole thing in the end wasn't anger. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was something much quieter and, I think, much more important. It was record-keeping. It was the habit of a careful man who spent decades writing field notes in notebooks that nobody else would ever read. I documented what I saw. I kept the statements. I kept the recordings. When Adele asked me what I had something to show her. That's not luck. That's the kind of slow, unglamorous diligence that most people don't think of as a form of strength, but it is. My grandson called it the shoulder man, Orion, the constellation we used to look for together on the back step. I think about that sometimes. The shoulder man has been in the same spot in the winter sky for longer than any human civilization has existed. It doesn't move because it's stubborn. It doesn't move because it's fixed to something real, something that doesn't shift with pressure or convenience or someone else's plan. I'd like to be more like that. I'm working on it. The things we do, the choices we make when we think no one important is watching, have a way of compounding. My daughter and her husband made a series of small choices that each seemed, probably, manageable in the moment. A transfer here, a forged signature there, a plan spoken in what they believed was a private room. Each choice made the next one easier, and then, because that's how these things work, the whole structure collapsed at once. Not because someone punished them from the outside, because the choices themselves carried consequences that were always going to arrive. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this, if they take anything at all. Not that people are punished for being greedy. Sometimes they aren't, not in any visible way, but that the kind of person you become through the choices you make quietly, over time, is the kind of person who will eventually stand on a porch, holding legal documents they never expected, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. I know what kind of person I want to be. I've always known, I think. The last few years just reminded me to mean it.